In the 3 months since George Floyd was murdered by the Minneapolis police, we've experienced an unprecedented uprising to defend Black lives, touching every city and town across the country. By several standards, it's the largest mass movement in U.S. history. And in demonstrations and other forms, it's still underway. Activists and organizers and strategists who are immersed in the uprising, not surprisingly, have been looking at what's the same and what's different about the fight for Black liberation today and the uprisings and the struggle against racism in the 1960s. It's both to draw lessons from that earlier period and to help analyze where we are today and what we need to do to go forward. My name's Max Elbaum. I'm one of the auditors of Organizing Upgrade. And today, OrgUp is going to take a look at that topic by talking with an activist and scholar who has spent decades immersed in the fight for a different world. Prexy Nesbitt has been active for more than 50 years in struggles, fights against racism and war, for decolonization and justice. He's participated in movements not just in the United States, but also in Europe and in Southern Africa. He's currently a presidential fellow of peace studies at Chapman University in Orange County, California, and he continues to engage the world on race and racism. Very glad to have you here today, Prexy. Thanks for joining us.
Max, I'm happy to be here with you.
Maybe you can start by telling us a little bit about the fights you've been immersed in and perhaps share one or two of the experiences that has most shaped your thinking.
I've had the fortune to be involved with many very global struggles, many in Southern Africa, as you noted. I think particularly the three that have been profoundly influential on me, and that is working with the Mozambique Liberation Front in the 1968-69 period, working very closely also shortly after that period with SWAPO, the Southwest African People's Organization in Namibia, and then throughout that period working very closely with the African National Congress. I did organizing on all those issues in the United States. I was very involved with the anti-apartheid movement. I was very involved in forming what was called the Mozambique Support Network. I was very involved as well in work I did with an organization that was called U.S. out of Angola, and then also an Angola-Cuba solidarity organization, where we met with the MPLA of Angola and then met in Cuba with them and with a broad array of organizations, including people from the Methodist Church and also from the American Friends Service Committee, and then various grassroots organizations. The Black Scholar magazine was involved in this. I've been very fortunate. As part of that work too, Max, I had the chance to work in both England and in Sweden with solidarity groups and anti-apartheid groups in both those places. And then finally, I think I can't go without mentioning that I spent a long period in Sri Lanka working with the Tamil Liberation Movement. That was work I did when I was part of the program to combat racism of the World Council of Churches, which in that capacity, I got to know the people at the Cohambee River Collective, one of the first women's movement collectives that the Black Lives Matter leadership has turned to for much of its guidance. The Cohambee River Collective was an extraordinary group of women. I'm happy to say that I was, as part of my work at the World Council of Churches program to combat racism, I had the fortune to meet them and to help finance their work, as well as meeting and working very closely with the Randall Robinson in Trans Africa, which would get to be very well known for its work mobilizing particularly the Black community in solidarity with the ANC, as led then by Nelson Mandela.
Well, you've certainly been close to many important movements, exciting movements, and won some important victories. And here we are again in a new upsurge time.
You know, I think about this time as being so reminiscent of those earlier periods. I mean, I think you mentioned George Floyd. I think George Floyd is this generation's Emmett Till. And for me, it even goes further. I remember being about 10 when the Emmett Till horrible murder took place, and I was in Chicago. He had come from Chicago and gone south. There was another killing that has never been dealt with that took place in Chicago about that time. And it illustrates how much this racial and white supremacist network and substructure in this country is so widely spread out, because there was a hammer killing of a young Black man at the corner of 55th and Kedzie in about 1954 or 55, the same time as the Emmett Till killing. And it's never been worked on, but I can never forget that, because my mother was so upset by the killing of Emmett Till. And then along, right on top of that, came this killing of this young man that has never been dealt with. And that's not unusual in Chicago, because the alderman we had on the west side of Chicago, where I was born and raised, 24th Ward, that alderman was a man named Ben Lewis. He was elected in about 1962. At the elections that spring, by the end of the week, had been shot to death in a barber's chair. Still remains an unsolved killing up in Chicago.
Well, you bring that perspective to the current moment, having seen those experiences here and across the world. Maybe you could comment on what you're seeing today and what you think some of the experiences are that inform today's uprising.
Well, I think one of the first things to think about is the fact that we have underlying this country this ethos of white supremacy. It's an ethos, and it's rarely dealt with. There have been great strides in dealing with it and educating people about it in this current moment, in the George Floyd moment of struggle. But behind it is stuff that is so deep in the setup of this country and the historical formation of this country. And it's also interrelated. The history of conquest, the history of slavery, what we did to Native Americans, what we did to slavery, what we did in terms of immigrant workers coming to this country. It's all woven into something that is very institutionalized in the fundamental fabric of this country. And that's, I think, realized by the young people of today, and they are going much further to look at this, I think, than what we succeeded in doing in the 60s to 80s period. And there's such wonderful writing that's now being done about all of this. And I think if we can keep moving young people forward, and I must say the young people and us old people got to tag right along with them. They need both of us. If we can keep this moving forward, we will reach a place in confronting this systematized, institutionalized racism in this country that we've never been to before. I think another thing is required in that, in this movement forward too, and that's a very critical thing, and that is that we have to bring along the global forces that are also mobilizing in response to this moment, because I think it's very important that we remember and bear in mind that The Black Lives Matter was a global movement. There was a global response to the killing of Floyd and the occupation of Minneapolis and the other killings that have ensued since, and the demand that the policing as killers be ended. And I think that we've got to make a link that we never really completed doing in the 60s to 80s period of struggle, but that now it's easier to do it, but it has to be done. We have to link to the Palestinian struggle, for example. We have to link to the struggle that Africa is going to face, particularly after COVID, because COVID makes this struggle that we have, it gives it further challenge. It means that the institutionalized racist fabric is also now reinforced by the public health fabric of repression that so much of the world is going to face. We know that, for instance, that the South African situation today, that despite Mandela, despite the African National Congress, that South Africa is not ready to begin to handle the kind of public health crisis that COVID is going to raise with people in South Africa, with people in the whole region of Southern Africa. And this becomes something that we need to reach out to and clasp hands with, because it's all one struggle. It's one struggle, and it's one major global struggle that we will be reinforced if the more we're able to make that global connections, the more successful we'll be in ending this institutionalization of the repression that we're facing that is all over. It's not just in the United States. It's not just in Black communities. It's not just Black and brown people. We have to also face, and this is going to be hard because there's such bitter feelings that have been developed in this country. We have to face what I think the SNCC people and SCLC people and others realized a long time ago, and that was that we can't let our bitterness against white people and racism stop us from having a relationship with white allies and white comrades of struggle. It cannot become a struggle against white people. It has to be a struggle against white institutions of racism. And there are many, all those thousands of white people, young white people who were marching in this last 6 months have shown that they're ready to go along. I teach these young white students. They're in a new point. And I think that was one of the keys to victory of the liberation movements of Southern Africa. They never made individual white people the enemy. It was always looking at the system of apartheid or the system of Portuguese colonialism. And I think we have to do the same thing today.
The period that you describe in the 60s, you were, like you said, you were fortunate to work. There were these liberation movements like SWAPO and Frelimo and the African National Congress. And the young radicals of today, those in the Uprising, are oriented toward internationalism, but the dynamic, the world map isn't the same. How do you think that they will be able to make the same principles that you just described a practical reality in terms of building those international ties and that international solidarity?
I think that COVID right now makes it very difficult. Obviously, it's something we can only talk about theoretically right now, but this won't last forever. Sooner or later, there'll be some modalities of once again being able to travel and to move around. And at that point, we have to maximize our connections and relationships to peoples and movements all over the world. The young people do a lot of this already, Max. They do it in their cultural ties. They do it in their music. But I think that what we have to call upon is much more explicit political actions and activities. For example, there have been people, I think Bill Minter and Imani Countess have done wonderful work about these hidden places of exploitation that are to be found all over the world, these places where there are pockets of maximal exploitation. Trump has maximized. He's used a lot of those. Others have too. Those are going to have to be taken on systematically and globally. We need to have a labor movement that is much more internationalist in its orientation and much less geared towards just doing things for a kind of a labor aristocracy, a white American labor aristocracy. We have to, right now, how can it be, for example, right now, these police unions protecting these white killer policemen are recognized in the labor movement of the AFL-CIO. The AFL-CIO has failed to move forward. I understand that the staff has begun to do that, but the overall move of the labor movement of this country has been very slow to play the progressive, forward-thinking role that they should be playing, not only in this country, but worldwide. And that's another part that taking place will mark a major step towards seeing the forces of revolution and change become international and globalized. I think that a lot of that has happened also with the women's movement. The women's movement has made great strides to see the internationalization of women and gender movements. The same thing also with people of alternative sexuality. They too have begun to move and understand that these are phenomena that require a global response, not just a response in the United States. And after COVID, the United States we're not going to be, the new normal is not going to include the United States being the big Mac master of the world. Those days are finished. The United States is going to have to begin to face these issues with humility and with willingness to partner in a way that we have never done before.
You mentioned Bill Minter and Imani Countess. They work on Africa Today, which highly recommended. A lot of their material is published there and in other places. Another thing I'd like to ask you about, Prexy, because of your deep roots in Chicago, there's a lot of discussion today about the interaction between on-the-ground movements and electoral struggles and people winning elected office. We have the Squad and so on. I wonder if you could comment about the Harold Washington experience in Chicago and what that meant and what were some of the lessons that we might learn from that.
Harold Washington and my work with him as part of his community relations team was part of the most wonderful time I ever had in my life. It was cut short by Harold passing. He was a man that was completely committed to seeing real change take place. I don't think there's a mayor that has ever been, except maybe Dinkins at one point when he welcomed Mandela after Mandela was freed and made his famous trip in 1990 to visit the United States and thank people on the trip. Incidentally, Max, that he went on to Cuba and got in so much hot water because he went to Cuba from the United States. Harold had that same kind of international perspective. And it's little known, but Harold welcomed and gave the keys to the city to one of the ANC leaders who replaced Mandela in that earlier period of 89, 88. Harold welcomed the SWAPO delegation to the city of Chicago. We held a conference supporting Angola with Harold's blessing. He was completely a global individual who saw the necessity of forming links all over the world. Harold went to Ireland while he was the mayor. This just stunned the reactionary, racist Irish elements of the white Chicago population. And it allowed space for progressive Irish people to begin to emerge and play a serious role with Harold and his agenda. Had Harold lived, he would have been one of the most progressive mayors to have ever lived in the city of Chicago, but to have ever lived in the United States, not just Chicago. And he was in such a key place. He realized that. He realized entirely the challenges that existed for him in the city of Chicago, given its background, its industrial base, its key centeredness in the whole industrial structure, this whole structure of capitalism in the United States. Harold was a very far-thinking, perceptive individual and had a tremendous way with people. Mandela had some of that too. Sisulu had some of that. But Harold, his slogans still ring all over the city of Chicago. You want Harold? You got him. That was one of his greeting. People used to come to meetings just to hear him say that slogan. So I think that we lost a lot when we lost Harold Washington. We lost a lot of forward movement, a lot of history, a lot of openings that could have been done.
You know, it makes me think about how much he was a pioneer when I think of some of the work that Ilhan Omar is doing today and making links between Africa and Palestine and the United States, Rashida Tlaib and some of the people in Congress. It would be just great if we had some mayors and governors that would try to play that kind of role. The whole Cubabaiting is still going on. I know you've been immersed in solidarity with Cuba.
It was very sad that that wonderful woman out of Los Angeles, she was clearly Cuba-baited out of any real consideration of her as a vice presidential candidate. I've had the great pleasure of knowing her before she became even the head of the Black Caucus. She's a wonderful, progressive woman who didn't get a shot because of something we have to get over in this country. I think young people today are far ahead of the older generation. They aren't as sucked in by red baiting as what was done in that period of the 60s to the 80s. But there is much work that has to be done about theory and about study that I think also has to be taken up by young people. One of the things that most impressed me in all the work that I did with the liberation movements, they studied all the time. Study never ceased. There was never a point that the serious liberation movement said, we've studied enough, we've schooled enough. The revolution was a constant source of study and more study. And I had the great pleasure working with one of the greatest of them all, Amilcar Cabral from Guinea-Bissau. I think he was one of the most brilliant minds and strategists that we had in the 20th century. His life was cut short far too early, and his writing and thinking, and I think it's an important point here, Max, that he represented a generation that worked together. All those people, Amilcar Cabral, Eduardo Monlani, Agostino Neto, Marcelino dos Santos Frelimo, from the PAIGC, the MPLA, from the movement that was in Sao Tome, the movement that took place in Indonesia. All of them worked very closely together with each other. So that when you heard a Cabral expressed in the 1966 Tricontinental Conference, he gave an analysis that Fidel said was the greatest analysis he'd ever heard. It was not just Cabral's thinking. It was the thinking of all those leaders coming out of the struggle against Portuguese colonies that had such close relationships with each other. One of those great minds who's still alive is a man named George Rebello. Some of your listeners undoubtedly knew of Samora Machel, who was killed, I think, assassinated by the South African government. But all of these people, Graça Machel, the one who married Nelson, they all showed a kind of collegial approach. They were a school of revolution and theory and strategy, and they fed off of each other all the time. I think that's one of the things that we need to learn to do better in this, our struggle here.
Yeah, well, the United States has always had a certain kind of anti-intellectual, anti-theoretical culture, although among the things that the new generation is breaking down, besides some of the barriers that you already mentioned about sexuality and gender roles and so on, you don't feel that there's the same attitude toward ideas in theory, a negative, attitude. There's a hunger for that. I think even, you mentioned Cabral, I think some of his works are being republished and reissued in new form.
The hunger is there.
To the source.
The hunger is there, Max. I agree. The hunger is there, but so many of the products of an American schooling system, as you just mentioned, that is bereft of any depth and any international understanding. We're dealing with a school system, and with my generation of people, they thought Africa was a country.
It's like our president.
Oh, don't even get started on that. He is so representative of that ignorance and stupidity and naivete, and it was summarized very neatly, I must say, by Michelle Obama in her talk. She subtly but very steadily, she pointed out all the inadequacies of him as a leader. It can't happen. These young people will bring much more depth, much more informed leadership into the struggle that will necessarily has to continue.
Well, you're bringing a lot of hope and optimism to this conversation, Prexy. I guess you've been through a lot of ups and downs and maintain that kind of spirit. I wonder if you'd maybe like to wrap up with some comments about how you see things unfolding from here, and if you're hopeful, what are the main reasons for that, and where we can go from here?
I'm hopeful because I know how much the young people I've met and worked with and taught over the last 50 years want to see change. They want to see change, to be agents of change. I'm hopeful because I see them not making many mistakes that our generation of struggle did make. I'm hopeful because to win, we have to be hopeful. I think that you cannot help to convince other people to move forward if you're grim and dour and negative and pessimistic. To be able to see the sun, you got to look for it and believe it's going to come. These are going to be rough days, don't get me wrong. The climate struggle that we're going to face in this world alone is one that we have to become much more savvy about, much more conscious. It's going to make a very difficult, objective situation in which we will struggle. But I think that there's a great awareness worldwide that we don't have in this country about the necessity of doing that climate struggle.
Well, thank you very much, Prexy, for bringing your wisdom, your experience, and your hope to this conversation. And I look forward to talking to you again.
Well, man, let's do it again.
Let's do it again. Let's take a few months. We'll take stock and see what kind of progress we've made, say in December or January. We'll take stock and look at next year.
That's right. And hopefully by that time, that golden-haired, the red-headed thing is gone. So we don't have to do that. The problem with that is, I think, Max, too many times we say, oh, this is a Trump problem. But we then ignore the depths of the real problem.